Sorry for a slow start. My laptop will be 10 this year. If I'm having problems now, I'm really worried about when it becomes a teenager. Okay, who here uses XSLT? All right. Has anyone here had the problem that you've got a really big DTD that you've got to transform to something else, and the DTD has been revised? Maybe you're moving documents from version 1.2 to 1.3 or something of a really big DTD. Yeah, some people have that. So I've had about a dozen of those recently, as it happens, with multiple clients. Sometimes it was going back to an older version of a DTD, which is quite exciting because you find there's elements that are not allowed. And maybe it's got 300 elements or attributes, something like bits or JATS. Has anyone here worked with those? Yeah. So what do you do? First, yes, people still use DTDs. I'm going to use the term DTD in this talk, and the software that I'm going to show you currently only handles DTDs, but in principle it could handle schemas as well for what it does. I have not had a need to make it do that. So, you've got 150, 300, whatever, however many elements in a DTD. It's spread in 20 files with inclusions in parameter entities. Every content model is 6 parameter entities in repeatable OR groups and sequences. And how are you going to see what's changed in the DTD? How are you going to figure out what would no longer validate with an identity transformation? And a slightly harder question is what might no longer validate with an identity transformation. So an example here, I'll take some examples from JATS, for example. XMLNS attributes, changing from being hash fixed with a URL to CDATA or the other way around. If in the input they're CDATA and in the output they're fixed, the CDATA could have any value at all and still be DTD valid. So an identity transform will generate something that will become invalid when you... It's not necessarily invalid, it just might be. So what we do is we go to whoever publishes the DTD. Let's hope it's not you. And, I mean, if it is you, you don't need to do any of this. You know what the answers are, right? You look for a change log. There's usually 2 kinds of change logs that you see. One of them is 14,931 entries long, and it contains every Git commit or something similar, and is just about useless. And the other is human maintained, and is fine but incomplete, but is a really good place to start, so that's what you look for. Then maybe you look for comments in the DTD. They'll tell you who maintained it, and if you're really lucky, there will be a change log in there, but again, it's maintained by humans. And it may or may not be complete, it may or may not be useful. So then you might try using, who here has used the Unix diff command, or the Linux diff command, or the, yeah. Who here thinks this is a good idea to use on a 10,000 line DTD? Right. 2 sarky bastards, all right. One problem you'll get with this is that text diff doesn't understand those parameter entities, those macros that are used. Just as if you're using XML schema, diff won't understand substitution groups. So there is software around to flatten DTDs, to expand parameter entities. It turns out one thing people often do when they revise a DTD is they remove an element from one parameter entity into another. And this is just because it's an internal category of entities for them, of elements. And what that will do is it will mean all the OR groups in the DTD will have the elements in different orders when you expand parameter entities. So text diff is a fail. DTD diff, which was written by Earl Hurd based on some code by Norm Welsh, exists. It doesn't actually work on the JATS DTD, but if you flatten the DTD, it does. But it's trying to give a text-based difference. It is better than Unix diff because it says for each element which attributes have been added or subtracted, which content models have been, which children rather have been removed or added. And you get a huge text-based report. There's a package called DTD Comparator, which is part of DTD-Analyzer. It also includes DTD Hattener, which turns out to be really useful if you're working with some of these large DTDs, because a lot of tools fall over with the parameter entities. I haven't figured out why, but they do. DTD Comparator produces an HTML report that uses kind of HTML tables to show you the difference between DTDs. And it gives an initial XSLT style sheet that you edit. Now, I'm actually glad I didn't find this before writing my own tool. Comparator was a sufficiently unlikely search term that I actually didn't find it. And I was looking for a DTD Hattener, and I got to the web page and said, oh, it does comparisons. But automatically generating a file that you edit is fundamentally wrong. Right? It's broken. Because you need to live in a world where you can maintain your transformation going forward when the next version of the DTD changes. So you need to be able to run that tool again without losing everything. So this isn't about sending a slight change request. It's about sending a change request that's the entire different way of working, which is slightly harder to achieve. Especially when the project I found had not actually been updated in several years. And there were open issues such as it doesn't sort the list of children. It also turns out that you don't need to handle all changes in practice. It's very rare. So, for example, I have a client who's moving from JATS 1.3 to JATS 1.2 to JATS 1.0, that's right, for some of their files. And they just drop MathML because they have everything in tech, and the people they're sending it to want the tech alternative and not the MathML. So it doesn't actually matter that there's 15 million MathML elements that are incompatible. They just wrote to me and said, please just drop all the MathML. No problem. So I wrote a tool called Eddic, named after a dead British king. It uses a SACS API to read DTDs. Not all SACS libraries give you DTD events, but some of them do. So what it constructs two empty documents that just have a top-level element and have the public identifier or system identifier you give it, and expands them, reads all the declarations, and ignores the fact that the document is usually not valid because most DTDs don't allow a single empty top-level element. It's fine. It generates a much more extensive report than the other tools. And it generates a style sheet that you do not edit, but instead you import it. And it uses a simple configuration file where you tell it which elements you've handled in your XSLT. That sounds weird, doesn't it? That's so that we have this cycle. You write a transformation, you run it on some test documents. Now, traditionally what happens next is you see validation errors, and you scratch your head and puzzle them out, right? How hard can it be? Well, with a DTD with 300 elements, when you get a validation error, it's not always clear where that came from in the XSLT. Now, you could, of course, be using a fabulous tool like Oxygen, the XSLT debugger. That does help, but it's still a lot of work. And if you've got, say, 5,000 or 10,000 input samples, sample documents, you're probably not going to sit and run Oxygen on 10,000 documents. So what I'm doing is I write a transformation and I run it on the test document. But that XSLT that I mentioned that Eddie writes, that you import, it's a 5 megabyte identity transform because what it's doing is it gives error messages in terms of not the input document, not the output document that you would get by validating, but the input DTD. So it will say things, the messages will say things like abstract contains overline start, not allowed in destination not allowed in destination. I was going to show you one, but because my display is a bit fragile, I think I'll leave that. So what you can then do, because the messages don't have a file name or a line number, you can sort them all and gather them together and deal with the 5 or 10 most common errors, which you might have 10,000 of first time round. Right, and this is really, you'll very quickly converge to a point where your 10,000 input documents all validate. That doesn't mean they're right, but they validate. And each time you deal with an element, I'm looking at automating that, I'll come back to that under future work, but each time you add an element to your style sheet that imports the Eddie one, you say, I've handled it. And you can say, copy in the configuration file, you can say it's manual or it's to be copied unchanged, or a few other things. And then the report has an index down one side. I'm going to hope there's a picture of it on the next slide. Yes, so here's an example. Kind of above me over here, this is an index to all the elements. The check mark means they're in the configuration file. If there's no check mark but they're grayed, they're okay. It's the same element in input and output, and it's got the same children. So I can ignore it. And if it's bold, it's not in the configuration file, or I've not marked it and it's different. And then here we can see, for the role element, for example, at the top it's not in the configuration file. And children differ. However, all these children are already configured. And there are all groups with different children as the content model. And you can see inline media index, you might not be able to read it from back there, but there's some grayed out element names there because they're not in the destination DTD. And I can't actually kind of scroll down directly, but if you pretend I've scrolled down, I didn't save the rest of the index on the right for this one for no particular reason. You can see it's telling me that the attributes differ and gives me a whole stuff about attributes. What you can't see on this display is that they're color-coded in this. Some of them have a blue background, which you may or may not be able to see. The ones in a blue background are only in the destination DTD. The ones with a white are in both, and ones with brown are in one. The zeros are a little bit of an ugly thing, and I should change it, so I should just get rid of them. they are, if it's a 1, it means the element's fit, it means the attribute has fixed content. It turned out that the version of, I switched libraries, SACS libraries, and this library gives you 0 or 1 rather than fixed or empty string. Okay. So at this point I was going to give you a demo of the HTML report, but I think I'm not going to try that because I was having difficulty projecting. When I get to the end of my presentation, I'll try it. It is kind of fun. Generated XSLT has a template for each element in the source DTD. And it has comments in it with the 2 different content models, the attribute list. That's why it's 5 megabytes big. And it also has an XSL message. You can override the messages in the configuration file. You can with a XPath expression and a message. But the default ones turn out to be useful enough for almost every case for me. Maybe someone else would, want to do that. I don't know. So the template will produce messages. I might have a slide with, yeah, here we are. Element sock has fabric attribute with incompatible value list, or declared in CDATA in source but fixed in destination, and so on. These are the kind of messages it produces, and I can just sort them, sort pipe unique or whatever on Unix. And I'm unique -c, and I'll get a count and the messages. Because the messages will all be the same anywhere in the DTD this occurs, they all sort together. The point of this is that I can do a cycle. I can run Eddic again when I've changed the configuration file. And I've said, I don't care about this particular element. Stop telling me about it, because I know that this customer won't ever have any. And those messages will go away. All right, so yeah, there's the sort. What I found most useful about this, though, was that the messages, before I had this, I would be running a validator against the output DTD. And I'd get messages like mml:"sup unexpected, expecting content, and then 300 mml elements in an OR group. And I look at this and say, what's wrong? Sup is in there. Oh, wait, I can't have a sup after, the order matters. Whereas, or, oh, look, sup isn't in there. Whereas if my error messages are in terms of the DTDs, my error message says sup isn't allowed in the destination DTD here. And it will generate an XSL:"if test equals mml:"sup, then XSL message, this element, whatever it is, contains sup not allowed in destination DTD. So, in production, what I do is XSL import, use when equals use Eddic2 equals yes. And to make that work, you declare use Eddic2 as a static parameter. As anyone here, use when is an XSLT3 thing, but it lets you have a conditional import so that you can turn it off and on. Because if you're running production, you don't need to load 5 megabytes of XSLT for each transformation, when really it's mostly an identity. It can delete elements and change namespaces, but a few other things. But basically, it's an identity. So, does it work? It turns out it doesn't make custard. But I've found that going from one large DTD to another of the order of JATS, bits, whatever, can typically be done in a few hours to get to the point where sometimes sometimes 1 hour less, to get to the point where all your input samples validate, assuming that they validated against the input, which not all clients will provide input documents that validate against their input DTD. Not all clients will tell you which DTD they want you to produce. They'll say, oh, did we tell you that one? We meant this other one. But I found that it's significantly faster than reading through the two DTDs. I also found that once you've got everything to validate, the report provides a really useful level of documentation. And you can navigate it easily. You can type the first letter of an element and it will scroll to the elements beginning with that letter, and has stuff like that. But it doesn't make it trivial, because the problem of converting one DTD to another is the same as the RDF problem of ontology matching, as it's called. So if they rename history to publication history in a DTD, but the changelog, the human changelog, doesn't say that, then the only way that you might figure that out, the Eddy report will say, this is the context in which this element occurs in the two DTDs. So you've got an event element that occurs in this context in one DTD, in this context in another, and you might say, oh yeah, it must be the same. And then maybe, if you're lucky, you can get documentation. For JATS, it's one of these Mulberry doorstep things, the taglib documentation, as they call it, that tells you about each element. There are circumstances where Eddy does not help. One of them is if your DTDs are not comparable at all, then it can kind of help to have Eddy make a report with the same input and output, because then you get the report and it helps you view the content models more easily than looking at the DTD. And Eddy doesn't currently know about DTD-specific items. Different versions of JATS have different ways of representing dates, for example. And people going from different versions typically want them converted, but you wouldn't guess that from looking at the DTDs. So future work looked at DTD-specific plugins, such as JATS dates. Turn the code from, it's really a prototype right now. It works, it's working for me fine, but it's a prototype. I would like to do some XSLT coverage report. I looked at using a Rex generated XPath parser to check match expressions in your XSLT to see if, you've got a template. When you in the config file you say I've got a template, do you have one? It doesn't currently handle element renaming, and that would be nice. It turned out that the library I used for the config file makes that really hard, but I'm just going to rewrite Eddy 2 and use a different library for the config file. Some people have asked for parameter entities in the report. So to see a version of the content model with the parameter entities as well as the expanded one. Supporting different schema formats. XSD is particularly hard. There's actually some fairly hard things about interleaving RNG, I think, but it should all be doable. I don't think there's anything show-stopping there, apart from it's a lot of work and I don't have any incentive. So probably what I will do is release, as soon as it's not a prototype anymore, release it on GitHub or GitLab. It's currently on GitLab, but release it on GitLab, and we'll see if other people are interested in helping contribute code for other schema formats, or I don't know yet. Okay. I guess that's it.
You mentioned the demo, no?
I mentioned the daemon.
Yeah, you say you show code after.
Sorry? Oh, a demo.
Yeah. No.
No, I don't think I can.
Okay,
yeah,
that's fine.
I'll happily show anyone at the break.
Okay.
My laptop's having. This screen is blank right now, and it's not meant to be. So I'm not going to try switching between programs. Well, maybe I can.
So we have time for question, 1 or 2.
Oh, there we are.
Oh.
I don't know if you can read that, but that is a live copy of the report. One of the things you can see is that it joins parentheses up to try and help you read content models. I think that's probably a pointless level of cuteness. This is if I type I don't know, I'll type a J, there's probably an element beginning with J. Journal ID, yeah, there we go. That one's configured. Content model is the same in source and destination. Attributes differ. So there's, and a little bit further down, I can see the list. Journal ID type is the one that's in both, but XML base, for example, is only in the source and not the destination. And journal ID is found in journal meta and related article near the bottom of the screen. And that's the same in both source and destination. This turns out to be really useful. So I've been able to add things, information as I think of it, that was not in the other DTD comparators and would actually be quite hard to produce in them. So that's actually been quite helpful.
Okay, thank you. So, question?
Yeah, Abel is.
Sorry.
Just a remark. I think it's very interesting indeed to analyze the XPath expressions in the XSLT. And you spoke of a parser, but using base X, you have an extension function which gives you the past expression as a tree. So this might be very handy.
Yes, although Eddic is not written in XQuery, so nor in XSLT. I could, but I don't actually have a DTD parser that can do parameter entities, and it might be the next speaker can help me with that, I don't know. Because XML DTD grammar is not context-free when you consider parameter entities as part of the grammar. I think.
Another question? Oh. 2. I saw you.
While he's going there, I'll also say I'm really most interested in you've got a template match equals foo, because in that case you've clearly handled the element. If you've got some complex expression, I'm not about to solve the halting problem to work out whether you've handled it or not. So it may be that it's sufficient for me to do something much simpler, because I only need to say, yes, that's definitely in the XSLT. That's enough. I don't know.
Yeah, you may have mentioned it, but then I missed it. Is this? Can we use this somehow? Or I mean, do you plan on making it publicly available, or?
Yeah, I was a bit evasive because right now it's in a private GitLab repository because it's a prototype. And it's a little hard to set up and not too hard. And it's written in an unfashionable programming language because I needed a language with SAX drivers that worked. So it's actually written in Perl.
Because there's still a lot of stuff out there that still uses DTDs. And
there is a lot of stuff that uses DTDs. There's a lot of stuff in Perl. It's relatively readable Perl because I'm always aware that I might be the person who has to edit what I'm writing. But so if you want a copy, you can come and talk to me. But I'm not distributing it because I want to rewrite it to something that's more productized.
Okay, well, I'll be in touch.
Yeah, that's fine.
So we'll have time for one other question.
Just for a quick clarification, did you really say someone wanted to go from JATS 1.2 to 1.0?
Yes.
That's scary.
It was a publisher of scientific journals who distributes to a number of feeds. I have two of them, actually. Two separate clients doing that kind of thing. One of them because they're receiving JATS 1.2 from an external source, and they're actually on JATS 1.1 internally. So that's 1.2 to 1.1. And the other one because they're moving to JATS 1.2, but they're giving files to various archives and other publishing portals or whatever in JATS 1.0. I actually persuaded them to use JATS 1.1 for one of their downstream, but it wasn't a big win because some of the others are on JATS 1.0.
Microphone.
Might not be who you think it is.
It might not be. One of the clients Liam is working with, I'm also working with, and I know that one of their JATS DTDs is heavily customized as well. So it's not even as straightforward as the standard JATS versions.
Yeah, that's quite common actually. People customize their JATS and then have to go to a standard version of JATS for sending to PubMed Central or whatever. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Liam.